Hey there bookish friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Megan, and today I'm coming at you with a slightly more serious video to give you a list of recommendations to learn about racism, Canadian edition. Just a quick trigger warning, there will be mentions of sexual assault and violence throughout the video, so just keep that in mind as I talk. Hey guys, so this is Editing Megan, and I just wanted to say that I filmed this video over a month ago before they found the bodies of children buried at the sites of these residential schools, and that's why I don't mention it in the video. So if I seem just a little bit too upbeat at moments, that's why. And I also wanted to say I'm going to leave a few more links and videos that I've watched since then down below, and I'm going to leave the links for you to go read the 21 Acts of Reconciliation down below. Please read that if you haven't. There's videos where people will talk about that as well, but please do your research because we really need to understand what we as white people and settlers on this land can do to help the indigenous people better than we have been for the past 500 years. So I'm just gonna say that. I'm gonna leave a few more links down below, and I'm truly horrified about this news, and it's so awful. I don't even have words to describe what the indigenous community is going through right now. All I'll say is that we need to be there to support them now more than ever, and listen to indigenous people when they tell their stories about what happened at these schools. And I'm just going to leave a bunch of links down below for you guys to go check out. And please don't forget to keep doing the work. We've got a lot of work ahead of us if we want to make Canada a safer place for the indigenous people and for people of color in general. So yeah, so keep all that in mind as you are watching the rest of this video. Okay, that's it for Editing Megan. So the first book that I want to recommend to you, you might have seen before because it's relatively popular, and that is Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard. This book took me about a month to read because there was a lot of intense subjects in it, and I really wanted to fully absorb the information that I was reading and do a little bit more research on my own as I was reading some of these stories and incidents and things that were still happening to this day. And this book goes back as early as 1444 when the first black people were stolen from Africa by European raiders, and then it continues on from there, and it deals with issues of slavery, racial injustice, environmental racism, misogynoir in Canada, the police brutality that black people experience in Canada and still experience to this day. And it goes into several different examples of black people who have been abused by the system and abused by police officers or killed by them, and it compares that to the amount of white people that has happened to. And it also mentions that the struggle of indigenous people are similar to the struggle of black people, though not quite the same. There's also a whole chapter on border regulation and immigration of black people, and I read this one story that chilled me to the bone of this one woman who came from Cameroon and was put in jail for 3 years because she didn't have paper. Well, she was escaping genitalia disfigurement, and she was pregnant, and she had to raise her son in jail, and then they sent her back to Cameroon because she didn't have paperwork. It was really, really awful to read that, and I know there are other stories out there like that. This is Canada, this is what Canada has done, and it's messed up. Then we have another chapter on the afterlife of slavery in the welfare system and how that affects families to this day. And we also have a chapter on the issues that black children face in education and the prison to pipeline school system that we have here as well. This book goes through so many issues that black people face in Canada, and it's really opened my eyes to a lot of things that I hadn't seen before, and it's one that I would highly recommend for you. I thought it was really well thought out and written. So the next book that I have that I want to recommend to you guys is this book, which is An Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, and I loved this book. Not in a sense where it was always happy and I was always pleased with what I was reading, obviously, but Thomas King's writing is very well done. He puts the information out there in a way that it's easy for you to read and a little bit easier for you to digest some of the things that you're reading. And his humor and sarcastic, sometimes dark humor, made me kind of chuckle a few times. Also really made me think and fully better understand the struggles that indigenous people face, even though I'll never have to face those struggles myself. And this book doesn't just mention Canadian issues, it mentions the whole of North America, because Aboriginal people don't see borders as we do. And Thomas King wanted to discuss all of North America rather than just focusing on Canadian or American. But he was born in Canada, so was a Canadian author, and I just wanted to highlight this book because I thought it was a really important read. It starts off at the beginning with Columbus mentions Pocahontas and how wrong her portrayal is in the media that we consumed as children, which I think most of us know that her story was very poorly done in the movie Pocahontas. And then it continues on till the 1980s, but it goes a little further than that sometimes, and he intersperses the history with his own stories and his own experiences of what he felt growing up as an Indigenous person, and it's really well done, and it works really seamlessly, and it flows really well. And he talks about all the issues that Indigenous people have had to face for the last few hundred years. I would highly recommend reading this book. It's really well thought out and written and talks about things that you might never have heard about because growing up, these are not things that they want to teach you because they don't want you to understand or to know about the struggles of Indigenous people. And it's really messed up that I never learned any of these things in school, but I'm glad that I'm able to educate myself now, and I would highly recommend reading this book. It blew my mind, a lot of the things that I never knew, and I'll say enough how much I love this book, and I think that it should be a required reading in North America schools because it is easy enough for teenagers and adults to digest the information, and I just would really recommend you to read this book. The next book that I have is a little bit different from all the other books that I'm going to recommend, but that is From the Ashes by Jessie Thistle. This is what I guess you would call a victim narrative, but Jessie Thistle is Métis and talks about his struggle growing up Native and being taken away from his father, who was an alcoholic, and then being raised by his grandparents, who were, or at least his grandpa was abusive, and it was really heartbreaking at times, but at the end he does manage to overcome it all, and his story was something that I don't want to say it's inspiring because nobody should have to go through something like this, but I think that it opened my eyes to what life is really like for a lot of Native people today and the racism that they experience that can really affect their life in negative ways and slowly chip away at them. And it was eye-opening, and I'm just gonna mention it here. Okay, so the last book that I have here with me that I want to recommend is Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent in the Security State by Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monaghan. And this book is the only book that I have that isn't written by Indigenous people. It's written by two white people, but they have done an insane amount of research and they have all their sources listed throughout this book. And it's all about the Canadian security state and what they have been doing to Indigenous movements that are trying to protect the land and protect the water. The first chapter is about the Algonquins at Berry Lake and how they have been protecting their land for years and are still trying to protect their land from colonizer Canada, and how they refuse to give up their land because it's baked into their religion and culture. The religion and the land are tied together to take them away from the land, just to take away their culture and religion and beliefs. So they will fight. So they are still fighting for the land against colonizer Canada, and it goes through a whole history of what has been happening there, of what has happened there, and what has been happening there in the last few decades. And the second chapter is all about the pipeline that is being built right now and that they have been working on building for the past decade. And it talks about the Indigenous people who have been fighting to stop the pipeline and the security state's efforts in making them out to be eco-terrorists and arresting them for being land defenders and water protectors. And the third chapter is all about the I Don't Know More movement, and if you haven't heard about that, then I would definitely just Google it, because it's a social media hashtag created by Native people to help defend the land and protect the water from colonizer Canada. And the third chapter talks about how the police have been monitoring social media and trying to stop protests and arrest Indigenous people for their crimes. And I haven't read the last chapter in this book, which is the fourth chapter, but it is about a lot of the same things, treaties and the security state advancing on Indigenous territory and trying to steal the land from Indigenous tribes and take away their culture and heritage in doing so. And I would definitely recommend reading this book. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I will, and I have been learning a lot from, and I have learned a lot from reading this. All the sources are listed in the book, and it is a worthwhile read, I'll say. The last book that I want to talk about, but I don't actually have, is one that I took up from the library several months ago, and I didn't quite finish it because it's a big book. It is the History of Canada Guide for Dummies. I haven't really read a lot of the For Dummies books, but this one, really worth it. The author of this book is really funny and also goes into detail about a lot of things that I knew nothing of, and I'm really upset that I didn't learn any of this kind of stuff in school. I learned about the Acadians. I learned all about the Acadians, the Chinese head tax, and a lot more about indigenous history. And I also learned something really interesting, that in 1776, the British Crown said that any land not sold or bought by the British shall henceforth belong to the native people who are living here. And so according to that, the entire province of British Columbia still belongs to the native people who live here, and I didn't know that. So anyone else living in BC, we're all living on unceded territory, keep that in mind. I actually kind of want to go buy this book at some point because I learned so much, and I can definitely go back and read through some of that information because it was very informative but also very funny at times and well written and well set. So if you want to learn a more comprehensive Canadian history, definitely recommend reading it. Next, I'm going to recommend a couple of stories that have to do with residential schools. So just another warning that a lot of these have rape and assault of minors and children in them, so if that's not something you can handle, they might not be for you. But while saying that, the first story that I have here, I have this DVD, Indian Horse, which is also a book, by the way, but I haven't read the book, and I've only seen this movie. This is a movie about Saul, who is taken from his family and forced into residential school and grows up and starts playing hockey as a way to cope with his life. And we see the racism that he has to face and the struggles and the effects that residential school have on him as an adult. And it's really heartbreaking, but I felt like it was an important story to watch. And I'm glad that I went out and I bought it because I thought that I should support smaller movies, and especially something like this. I feel like this is a really important story to understand how residential schools still affect people today, because remember, the last one didn't close till 1996, and there are still thousands of people alive who were in these schools and who were very negatively affected and impacted by what happened to them in these so-called schools. And the next story I want to mention is We Were Children. This documentary is told from the point of view of two survivors of residential schools who were kidnapped when they were young children. We see how they were taken from their families and how their culture and identities were stripped from them, and how they were essentially tortured and beaten at these schools. It was really heartbreaking and sad to watch, but again, I feel like it was a really important story to see so we can understand the effects of residential school on Native people and the horrors and the trauma that Native people still have to face from residential schools today. The next movie that I want to recommend is There's Something in the Water. This is a documentary that was taken by Elliot Page. This is also based off of a book, and he does interview the author and he does meet the author in the documentary, but it is specifically about environmental racism, specifically in Nova Scotia. Elliot goes back to his homeland where he sees a Black community who have been very negatively affected by the environmental racism and the garbage that has been kept being heaped on their land, and all the people who have gotten cancer and who have gotten very sick from all this garbage that they have been forced to live near and that has been dumped on their land and been polluting their water and land. And then we also see another indigenous community that has also been negatively affected by environmental racism and how the government keeps putting garbage and pollution near their land because they don't actually care about these minorities and they just want a place to put their garbage. And also what is really heartbreaking is the lack of response from our government, including Trudeau, who has ignored Indigenous rights and ignored their pleas to get clean water to their communities, and how they are still struggling to this day because not all reservations have access to clean water because of environmental racism like this, and their fights to get their land and water cleaned up and to get the pollution removed from their water and the struggles that they have been dealing with. That's what this one is about. Highly recommend. I found it on Netflix. It's definitely worth a watch. And the last one I want to recommend is a podcast. I've been recently getting into podcasts in the last year or so. So this podcast that I want to recommend is called The Secret Life of Canada. And this podcast is hosted by a Black woman and Indigenous woman, Fallon and Leah. And they are very funny and entertaining to listen to. I've only listened to the first season and a half. There's 3 seasons out now. And I have learned so much from their podcast. They've taught me so many things about Canada that I never learned in school, about all the way from the first Black person who was brought to Canada to Indigenous struggles today to the Ukraine concentration camps that happened in Banff in the 1918. They also have little shorts where they'll mention historical famous Black people, famous Asian people, and it really has taught me a lot about Canada that I never knew. And I would highly recommend this podcast because I know that I've learned about a lot of people and events that happened that I never knew, and it's made me research more about them. So this one has history on Indigenous people, Black people, Asian people, and just a lot of unknown things that have happened in Canada that have been swept under the rug or haven't been taught in schools because the Canadian government doesn't really think that these are important enough for us to know about, or they just flat out don't want us to know about these things. So I would highly recommend listening to this podcast. These two ladies are very funny and very entertaining, and they're very witty, and I have just learned so much from their podcast. Give it a listen to. Okay, so that's all the resources that I have to recommend to you for this video, and I just want to say that I know as a white person I won't ever have to face the struggles that Black people or Indigenous people or Asian people have to do in Canada, and I just kind of wanted to acknowledge my white privilege there. That being said, I do think as a white person we should be educating ourselves and trying our best to understand and for minority groups who are struggling and continue to struggle in our racist colonial country. So that is all I have for this video for recommending to you guys. I really hope that you guys will read some of these or listen to some of them or watch some of these shows. Really, I found them really informative, and they really taught me a lot and opened my eyes to things that I had never thought about. I just wanted to put out this video and give you a list of recommendations so that you can learn more about the struggles of other people and just learn more about Canadian history, because there's a lot of fascinating things out there that we were just never taught about. So that is all for this video. You guys can comment down below if you've read or listened to or watched any of these things that I've mentioned, and you can also comment down below any more resources that you have for learning about racism in Canada or racism in other countries. Yeah, I appreciate all of you, so thank you so much for watching. And I wish you all the best in further educating yourselves. So, that being said, bye for now.